In a quiet room in a museum in Paris, there stands a pillar of black stone, taller than a man, polished and cold to the touch. Carved down its whole face in row upon row of ancient wedge-shaped writing are the words of a king dead for 37 centuries. His empire is gone. His city is gone. His gods are no longer prayed to. But the law he wrote is still there, still legible. And anyone who walks up to that stone can read it to this day. Last time, we stood over a low mound of sand in the land between the two rivers and told the story of the world's first empire, the empire of Sargon of Akkad, which rose out of that land and fell back into it until nothing was left but the clay. And we made you a promise that we would stay here in this same land between the Tigris and the Euphrates and watch a new kind of king rise out of the ruins the first empires left behind. Not a conqueror this time, a lawgiver. His name was Hammurabi. Long after Sargon's Akkad had turned to dust, and after the great city of Ur had risen and fallen in its turn, a small kingdom on the middle Euphrates grew into the greatest power the region had known, Babylon. And Babylon's most famous king is remembered, above all the warlords of his age, for a single thing. He took everything the ancient world had learned about power and about justice, and he carved it into that great pillar of black stone for every subject to read and to obey. You have almost certainly heard of it, and almost everything the classroom tells you about it is a little wrong. It was not the first written law. It was not equal justice for all. And scholars are not even certain it was ever truly law at all. This is the real story of Hammurabi's Code, and of how a stone came to outlive the man, the city, and the empire that made it.
Let us begin by taking away the thing everyone thinks they know. You have surely heard Hammurabi's Code called the first written laws in human history. It is a wonderful phrase, and it is not true. Kings had been writing down laws for 300 years before Hammurabi was born. The oldest law code that survives to us was set into clay around 2100 years before the Common Era, in the Sumerian city of Ur. We call it the Code of ur-nammu, after the king in whose name it was issued, roughly 3 full centuries older than Hammurabi. And it already does the things we imagine Hammurabi invented. It lays out its rules case by case, and for some injuries it even sets a payment in silver rather than demanding blood. Nor was ur-nammu alone. In the century and a half before Hammurabi, other kings issued their own collections, the laws of Eshnunna and the code of a ruler named Lipit Ishtar. Reach back further still, and there are references to a reformer named Urukagina centuries earlier, though his own words are lost. Written law in this land was already old when Hammurabi came to it. So why, if he was not the first, do we remember his code above every other? Why is his the name in the textbook and not ur-nammu's? That question is the whole point of this story. Hammurabi did not invent law. What he did was make law a monument. He took the rules that govern a people and carved them into stone taller than a man, and set that stone up in the open, where anyone could stand before it. He did not write the first law. He wrote the first law built to last. His is not the first code. It is the first great one. And great is a word we are going to have to earn.
To understand the man, understand how small he began. When Sargon's empire fell, and then the great revival under the kings of Ur fell after it, the land between the rivers broke apart once more into its old patchwork of quarreling city-states. And on the middle stretch of the Euphrates sat one of the smaller of them, a city called Babylon, ruled by a line of kings from a people called the Amorites. For its first century, Babylon was nobody. One modest kingdom hemmed in by stronger neighbors, Larsa to the south, Eshnunna to the east, the powerful kingdom of Mari upriver, and the rising might of Assyria to the north. Then, by the most common reckoning, around the year 1792 before the Common Era, the throne of Babylon passed to its sixth king, a young man named Hammurabi. And for most of his long reign, Hammurabi did something very hard for an ambitious king to do. He waited. For some 30 years, he was patient and careful, digging canals, raising temples, strengthening his walls, and keeping the peace with neighbors far stronger than himself. To the great powers around him, he must have seemed no threat at all. And then, late in his reign, an old man now, in the last decade of his life, Hammurabi struck. In a lightning run of campaigns, the great rivals fell one by one. Larsa defeated, Eshnunna broken, Mari taken, the kingdoms of the upper land absorbed. In just a few short years, almost the whole of Mesopotamia, the very land Sargon had once bound together, came under the rule of Babylon. So yes, Hammurabi was a conqueror. But here is the turn. Last time, we told you of a king the world remembers as its first great conqueror. This king we remember for something else entirely. Because once he had won the land with an army, Hammurabi reached for a way to hold it that no army could ever give him. He reached for the law.
And what he made is the black pillar in that quiet room in Paris. Let me put you in front of it. It is a single piece of hard, dark stone, polished black basalt, though older books sometimes call it diorite. Either way, a dense, heavy rock, chosen because it would not easily wear or break. It stands about 2¼ meters tall, over 7 feet, taller than any man who ever stood before it. Its whole surface, from top to bottom, is covered in the most beautifully carved writing that survives from the ancient world. But before you read a single line, your eye is pulled to the very top, because there, carved in relief, are 2 figures. One is a king, standing in reverence. The other is a god, seated on a throne, with what look like rays of fire rising from his shoulders. This is Shamash, the sun god, and in this land, the god of justice himself. Nothing was hidden from the sun, who saw every wrong in the land, and so the sun was its divine judge. The king standing before him is Hammurabi, and watch what passes between them. Shamash holds out toward the king 2 objects, a rod and a ring, or a coiled cord, the measuring rod and the measuring line, the tools you use to make a crooked thing straight. They were the ancient symbols of just authority, and the god is handing them to the king. The meaning of that image needs no words, and everyone who saw it understood it at once. This king's right to judge does not come from himself, it comes from the god of justice. The law carved below is not one man's opinion, it is justice handed down from the divine and set to stand in stone. This is how kingship in the ancient world gave its law its authority, and it is here, at the crown of the pillar, that the light in our story begins to glow.
Below the 2 figures, the stone speaks, and it speaks in 3 voices. First comes a prologue, long and soaring, less like law than like a hymn. In it, the king announces who he is. He was called, the stone declares, by the great gods, and above all by Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, and appointed to a single sacred task, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, and, in the phrase that is the very heart of the whole monument, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. Then come the laws themselves, the long body of the text, roughly 282 numbered provisions in the count we use today, carved case after case down the length of the pillar. And then, at the bottom, comes the 3rd voice, the epilogue. And here the king turns and speaks across time to us. He blesses any future ruler who will honor his words and keep his laws standing. And then he curses with a long, terrible, magnificent string of curses anyone who would deface this stone, erase his name, or alter what he has written. May the gods strip such a man of everything, the stone says. May his name be forgotten. Stop for a moment on that. It is the same thing we have heard before in this same land. Gilgamesh's story survived on clay. Sargon's lost empire survives only as clay. And here is a king who understood 4,000 years ago exactly what he was doing. He knew that stone outlasts flesh, that a thing written down and set in the open can outlive the hand that wrote it. He was reaching past his own death, trying to make his justice permanent. He wanted the record to endure. And it did, though not at all in the way he hoped.
So, what does it actually say? Almost every law on the stone follows the same simple shape. If a man does this, then that shall be done to him. Not grand principles, specific, concrete cases, each with its verdict attached, the way a scribe lays out a worked example. And the range of ordinary life they cover is astonishing. There are laws about builders. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. And, chilling to our ears, if the collapse kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death. Professional responsibility, 4,000 years old, carved in stone. There are laws about doctors. A surgeon who successfully opened a patient with a bronze blade could earn a good fee set in advance in the stone. But if the patient died under his knife, the surgeon might lose his own hand. High reward and terrifying risk. There are laws that fix a laborer's wage and govern the tavern keeper who waters her beer. And there are laws of marriage and dowry and divorce, of adoption and inheritance, and the passing of property from father to son. The whole texture of daily life set down and made fixed. And then there is the famous one. If a man destroys the eye of another, then his own eye shall be destroyed. If he breaks another man's bone, they shall break his bone. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The phrase we still use was already ancient when it was carved here. But here is what the classroom almost never tells you. That justice was not the same for everyone. This was a society of ranks, and the code names them. At the top, the Owilim, the free man of property. Below him, the Mushkinum, the commoner, the dependent. And below him, the Wardum, the slave. And the punishment depended entirely on who you were and whom you had harmed. An eye for an eye applied in its literal form, meaning between free men of equal rank. But if a man destroyed the eye of a commoner or the slave, he did not lose his own eye. He paid a fixed weight of silver set down in the stone. So the law was not equal, but it was something new all the same. It was public and it was fixed. The same written penalty for the same kind of case, set in the open for all to see, above the whim of whatever official sat in judgment that day. That was the true advance. Not that the law was kind, but that the law was known.
Now, that phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, may be ringing a particular bell, because you have likely heard those exact words somewhere else. In the Hebrew Bible, in the law given to a much later people, the very same principle appears. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And people notice this. They see the idea standing in Hammurabi stone centuries before it was written into scripture, and they leap to a dramatic conclusion, that one simply copied the other. So let us be careful here, because the truth is more interesting than the shortcut. What scholars actually see is not copying, it is a shared idea. The principle of proportional punishment, that the penalty should match the harm, no more and no less, ran all across the ancient Near East, appearing in the laws of many different peoples over many centuries. And to an ancient mind, a punishment measured exactly to the crime was not cruelty, it was a limit. It said that a man who took your eye could lose only his eye, not his life, not his family, not everything he owned. Proportion was a way of stopping vengeance from spiraling without end. Whether any one of these codes shaped another, and in which direction, is a genuine and open question among scholars, and we will not pretend to settle it here. The honest answer is that these were kindred expressions of a very old and widespread idea about justice, not one people stealing from another,
but many peoples across a shared world reaching for the same principle. That is the neutral way to see it, and it is the accurate one.
And now the strangest twist of all, the one scholars argue over and that almost never reaches the classroom. Was Hammurabi's Code ever actually the law? For a long time, the answer seemed obvious. Here is a great king. Here is a great stone covered in laws. Surely these were the statutes of his realm, the rules his judges reached for, the law of the land enforced across the empire. But then scholars looked at something else that survived. The thousands of records of real legal cases from Hammurabi's Babylon and the centuries after. Real disputes, real verdicts, real courts. And in all those records of actual trials, the Great Stone is almost never mentioned. Judges do not seem to have cited it. They ruled by custom, by precedent, by the king's own command. But they do not appear to have looked up the law on Hammurabi's pillar and applied it the way we apply a statute today. So a different idea has taken hold, argued by the great scholar Jean Bottero and by many since. Perhaps the stone was never meant to be a working law book at all. Perhaps it was something grander and stranger, a monument to the king's justice, a declaration to the gods above and to all the ages after that Hammurabi had ruled justly. Or perhaps it was a scholar's masterwork, a great collection of model cases admired and studied, rather than a code enforced. We may never know for certain which it was. And here is the beautiful thing. For our story, it does not finally matter. Because whether it was the working law of an empire or a king's monument to his own justice, it remains the fullest surviving window we possess into how a Mesopotamian king believed justice ought to look. And it reached us nearly whole for one reason above all. Because it was carved to endure. And now, at last, the story of the stone itself, which is stranger than any law carved upon it. Hammurabi set his pillar up in public, most likely in a temple of the sun god, so that his justice would stand before the eyes of gods and men. And there, or somewhere like it, it stood for 600 years. The king died. Within 2 generations, the great empire he had built shrank back toward a single city, and Babylon's golden age passed. But the stone remained. Then, around the year 1155 before the Common Era, some 6 centuries after Hammurabi, a conqueror came. His name was Shutruk-Nahunti, a king of Elam, the land to the east. He raided down into Babylonia, and among the treasures he hauled home to his capital, the city of Susa, was the great black pillar of Hammurabi. It was war loot now, dragged from the land that made it, carried hundreds of miles east, and stood up in a foreign city as a trophy. And this conqueror did one more thing. He took a chisel to the face of the stone and scraped away a whole block of the ancient laws, most likely to carve his own name and his own triumph there instead. But he never did. He left only a scar of blank stone where the law had been. And there the pillar stood, in exile, until Susa too fell and was forgotten, and the stone toppled and was buried, and the earth closed over it. And there it lay, for 3,000 years. The empire gone, the king a half-remembered name, the city that made it lost, and the city that stole it lost as well, and the great pillar of black stone lying silent in the dark, its law unread by any living eye for 30 centuries. Until the winter of 1901. A French expedition, led by the archaeologist Jacques de Morgan, was digging into the ruined mound of Susa, and struck something hard and dark and smooth in the earth. They brought it up in 3 great pieces, and there, running down the polished black stone, were the laws of Hammurabi, as sharp and legible as the day they were carved. Within a year, a scholar named Jean-Vincent Scheil had deciphered the ancient writing and given its words back to the world. And since the year 1904, it has stood in the Louvre in Paris, where anyone may walk up and stand where kings once stood and read the will of a man who died 37 centuries ago. The empire fell, the king died,
The very stone was stolen and scarred and buried for 3,000 years. And still, the Lord survived.
So what, in the end, did Hammurabi leave us? Not an empire. That was gone within living memory of his death. What he left was the stone, and the idea carved into it. For more than 1,000 years after he died, scribes across Mesopotamia copied his laws onto clay and studied them, which is how we can even recover the very block of laws that Elamite conquerors scraped away. The copies preserved what the chisel destroyed. His code became the great model, the measure against which the ancient world imagined what a law code should be. And we should be honest about the limits of that legacy, because pop history often is not. Hammurabi's code is not the secret source of our laws. It did not flow in a straight line down the centuries into the courts of today. But it remains the best preserved, the most complete, and the most famous emblem the ancient world ever produced of one powerful idea: that law should be written down, set in the open, and made the same for like cases, above the whim of any one man. Not the first law, but the first great monument to the idea of law. And so we return, one last time, to the thread that has run through all of these stories. For the king Gilgamesh, the clay tablet was comfort, proof that a man's words can outlive his body. For Sargon of Akkad, the clay was a warning that nothing built by power endures. And for Hammurabi, the black stone is something else again. It is a promise kept. A king reached across time, tried to make his justice permanent, cursed anyone who would erase it. And against every odd, across the fall of his empire, the theft of his monument, and 3,000 years in the dark, the record he made survived to be read by us. Power dies. The lawgiver dies. The stone remains. And here, at last, we leave the land between the two rivers. For a long time we have stayed on this narrow plain and watched its kings rise and fall. Next time, we follow the same thread, the record that outlives the king, westward to another great river, and to a people who carved their power into stone on a scale that still staggers the world. Their kings too believed they could defeat death by building, and their monuments are still standing, waiting in the sand for us to come and read them. Until then, if you want to understand how our world was built and how our oldest stories still shape it, stay with us and subscribe. The Codex closes until the next story.